So we now have a player entity, we're able to move the player entity, and we have a camera which will revolve around the player entity and move with it. The next thing that I want to do is get some basic animation for this player. We already have some very basic animation set up. In this case, I'm going to my assets folder, and I still have the default scene which I set up here. If I enter the scene and play, we'll see that I have my prototype character here, and this character has some idle animations running on it. I can open my animator tab, and I can look at the animation controller for this character. This animator has a single parameter, and that parameter is called speed. If I change this parameter, the character will start walking. So this is our original prototype character, and we're going to be using this and developing this character. I'll be building my base animations with this character. So essentially what we want to do now is we want to get this character, and in the scene with the entities we want to have our animated character showing up instead of the capsule character. There is, however, one problem which I have here, and that is currently the dots implementation for Unity does not have any specific way of dealing with animation. While ECS is now officially production ready, it does not have any built-in animation or navigation systems. We'll need to be able to work with both of these systems in order to create the prototype, so in order to progress we're going to need to find a way to work with animation. There are already some assets in the asset store which will allow us to use animation, but I do not want to buy anything at this point. At the moment this project is just screwing around. I could also try and program this by myself, but I do not want to take on that kind of commitment at the moment. So I'll need to look for another option. And there is another option which exists, and that is to use the game object-based animation within Dots. That is because the ECS system has been set up in a way which will allow you to access existing game object systems and use them within your projects. This is not the ideal situation, but it should allow us to test and prototype anything we need. Essentially, we can prototype using any existing game object system. If a more efficient system becomes available, I can always switch to it later. And if necessary, I can always choose to commit to custom systems later. So now we're going to try and load in some basic animation. The entity that I want to attach this to is my player, so I am going to update my player subscene. For the moment, I'll actually edit the player prefab, and I'm going to turn off the capsule visualization, as this will hide the animation if it does show up. Next, I'm going to add a game object to my scene. I'll call this player anim, as this will store my player animation. I can add this to the player subscene. I'll then add a new script in my player script, and this is going to serve as an authoring component, and I'll call this auth player anim. This script can then be placed onto my player anim game object. That will prepare the scene. I can now edit the script. This is going to be an authoring component, so it will remain as a modern behavior. And we're going to add a game object here. I'll call this game object prefab. In order to attach this to my entities, I'll need a baker class. This will be public class, bake player anim. This will inherit from baker, and we're going to bake the auth player anim class. We'll need to specify that we're using the entity library. So this will be using unity.entities. I can then implement my overrides. I'll remove the exceptions. Previously, we've been using an add component function. Now we'll be using an add component object function. The component that this will add will be a game object. In order to use this, I'll need a reference to my entity. The type will be an entity, and this will be called entity. I'll set this using the getEntity function. And for the moment, I'll set this with transformation flags to be dynamic. The first argument of my add component entity will be set with my entity, and what we'll attach here will be the prefab. To do this, we'll need to create a component type for our prefab. Previously, I've stored my component types within the authoring scripts, as most of the components so far will be used exclusively for those entities. And while at the moment this is only going to apply for the player, in the future I may well have other entities which will need to have this component attached to them as well. So I'll return to Unity, and we're going to add another script for this component. So I'll create a new C# script. This will be called CMP Player Anim. So this will be a script specifically for components. Player Anim is probably not a good idea for naming here, so rename this to CMP Game Object. I can now edit this. I do not need the class in the script, so I can remove this. I'll now create my component. This will be a public class. I'll call this GeoPrefab. This is essentially a game object prefab. This will inherit from iComponentData. This will contain a public game object, and this will have the variable name of prefab. So this will give us our component, and we can now use this to register our component on the entity. So this will be a new game object prefab. I'll then need to set the prefab value from this, and this will be set with our authoring component.prefab. This is not working because I've not set this to be public. So we should now be able to create a prefab object which we'll attach to this character component. So I can return to Unity and we can work with the player anim object, and I should now have the option to add a prefab to this game object. We do not yet, however, have a prefab which we can add to this, so I'm going to go to my prefabs folder and we're going to create a prefab under the player folder. I'll do this by creating an empty game object. Once again, I'll be calling this player anim for our player animation. I'll then go to my FBX folder. I have my prototype character here, and this can be added to the game object. This will not currently have an animation controller, so I'll add my animation controller to this. I'll return to my prefab folder, and I'll drag this onto the folder. I can then remove the prefab from the scene. I'll now work on the player anim object in my subscene, and I can add the prefab to the slot in my authoring component. We can now test, and we'll still see that there's no animation showing. So I'll now need to return to my scripts, and we'll need to update these so we can get the animation to show. So for now I've got two options. I can either create a new script with which to control our animation, or I can do this within the player script. For the moment, I'm going to do this within the player script. The animation will not be part of the player entity, so I'm going to create an entity command buffer to store it in. I'll store this in a variable ECB, but I'm not going to create a new command buffer for this. I'm going to use an existing one. So I'll do this with systemapi.getSingleton. The buffer that I'm going to get is called begin fixed step simulation entity command buffer system. From this, I'll access this with .singleton. I'll then call .create command buffer, and we'll create this in state.worldUnmanaged. I can now use this buffer to help manage the prefabs. I'll do this in a for each loop. I'll have two variables. The first will be called prefab, and the second will be called entity. And we'll get these with systemapi.query. The component that we're looking for will be our game object prefab. I'll also want to have the relative control over the entity, so I'll specify with entity access. I'll now create a game object. In this case, I'm just going to call this game object. I'll use this game object to create an instance of my prefab. So I'll use gameObject.instantiate, and the argument will be set with our prefab. And of course, this is referring to my component. To get the prefab from the component, I'll need to use prefab.prefab. I can save this, and we should now have an instance of our animated character being created within the fixed simulation step command buffer. So I can open my systems window. Under the updates, we should have the simulation system group. And here we should have our begin simulation entity command buffer. And this is where we want to have the animation being created. To test if this is doing anything, we can play. And I am now seeing my player prototype model. However, this should be an animated model. So we should be able to go to our animator window, and I should be able to change the speed here, and the model should move forward. So we are creating our model, and it is being instanced every single frame. However, it is retaining the instance every single frame. So we have our character showing up, and it is being animated, but there are some obvious issues with this, and it is still not directly linked to our entity. And we'll continue working on that next.